Alright, blog time. It is right after the last vlog, not blog. Alright, and I get right back to doing the puzzle. Oh, that doesn't match. Oh, whatever. Get back to work. There we go. Get the book. Get everything ready for another wholesome vlog. Starting off with a burp. That's classic Z-Bear. Oof, that was a rough one. Alright. Here's our next chapter. It's called The Butcher Shop. We've got 2 quotes. Randomized screening trials are bothersome. It takes ages to come to an answer, and these needs to be large-scale projects to be able to answer the questions. But there's no second best option. And that is by H.J. de Kooning in Annals of Oncology, sorry, of 2003. There we go. Just saw a puzzle piece I had to put in. Alright, let's keep going. The best doctors seem to have a sixth sense about disease. They feel its presence, know it to be there, perceive its gravity before any intellectual process can define, catalog, and put it into words. Patients sense this about such a physician as well, that he is attentive, alert, and ready, that he cares. No student of medicine should miss observing such an encounter. Of all the moments in medicine, this one is most filled with drama, with feeling, with history. And that is by Michael Lacombe in Annals of Internal Medicine of 1993. Lots of annals in this chapter. Well, I see 2 annals and that's what I say. Yeah, 2 annals means a lot. Wow. What great observation I have. Alright, let's get into this. Stop doing the bloody puzzle, man. It was in Bethesda, at the very institute that had been likened to a suburban golfing club in the 1940s, that the new arsenal of oncology was deployed on living patients. In April 1955, in the midst of a humid spring in Maryland, a freshly recruited researcher at the National Cancer Institute named Emil Freireich walked up to his new office in the red brick Clinical Center building and found, to his exasperation, that his name had been misspelled on the door, with the last 5 letters lopped off. That is more than a misspelling. That's kind of an abbreviation. The plate on the door read, Emil Frey, MD. My first thought, of course, was, isn't it typical of the government? It wasn't a misspelling. Oh, that's what I said. It wasn't a misspelling. When Freireich entered the office, he confronted a tall, thin young man who identified himself as Emil Frey. Freireich's office, with the name correctly spelled, was next door. Oh, I see. Classic government, honestly. Their names notwithstanding, the 2 Emils were vastly different characters. Freireich, just 35 years old and fresh out of a hematology fellowship at Boston University, was flamboyant, hot-tempered, and adventurous, just like me. He spoke quickly, almost explosively, with a booming voice that was followed often by an even more expressive boom of laughter. He had been a medical intern at the fast-paced Ward 55 of the Cook County Hospital in Chicago, and such a nuisance to the authorities that he had been released from his contract earlier than usual. In Boston, Freireich had worked with Chester Kiefer, one of Minot's colleagues who had subsequently spearheaded the production of penicillin during World War II. Antibiotics, folic acid, vitamins, and antifolates were stitched into Freireich's soul. He admired Farber intensively. Not just the meticulous academic scientist, but the irreverent, impulsive, larger-than-life Farber who could antagonize his enemies as quickly as he could seduce his benefactors. I have never seen Freireich in a moderate mood, Fry would later say. If Freireich had been a character in his film, he would have needed a cinematic foil, a Laurel to his Hardy, or a Felix to his Oscar. Don't know what those mean. The tall, thin man who confronted him at the door of the NCI that afternoon was that foil. Where Freireich was brusque and flamboyant, impulsive to a fault, and passionate about every detail, Fry was cool, composed, and cautious, a poised negotiator who preferred to work backstage. Emil Fry, known to most of his colleagues by his nickname Tom, had been an art student in St. Louis in the 30s. He had attended medical school almost as an afterthought in the late 1940s, served in the Navy in the Korean War, and returned to St. Louis as a resident in medicine. He was charming, soft-spoken, and careful, a man of few chosen words. To watch him manage critically ill children and their testy, nervous patients was to watch a champion swimmer glide through water, so adept in the art that he made artistry vanish. Usually if someone's really adept, then it would be artful, right? I'm not sure what he means by so adept in the art that he made artistry vanish. Wouldn't being adept be the art? I don't know. Maybe I'm definitely overthinking that. Alright. The person responsible for bringing the two MOs to Bethesda was Gordon Zubrod, the new director of the NCI's Clinical Center. That's a great name. Gordon Zubrod. Intellectual, deliberate, and imposing, a clinician and scientist known for his regal composure, Zubrod had arrived at the NIH having spent nearly a decade developing anti-malaria drugs during World War II, an experience that would deeply influence his early interest in clinical trials for cancer. Zubrod's particular interest was children's leukemia, the cancer that Farber had plunged into the very forefront of clinical investigation. But to contend with leukemia, Zubrod knew, was to contend with its fieriness and brittleness, its moody, volcanic unpredictability. Drugs could be tested, but first, the children needed to be kept alive. A quintessential delegator and Eisenhower of cancer research, as Freireich once called him, Zubrod quickly conscripted two young doctors to maintain the front lines of the wards, Freireich and Fry, fresh from their respective fellowships in Boston and St. Louis. Fry drove cross-country in a beat-up old Studebaker to join Zubrod. Freireich came just a few weeks later in a ramshackle Oldsmobile containing all his belongings, his pregnant wife, and his 9-month-old daughter. Who the hell has sex with their wife after just 9 months? Not even 9 months, because their wife is already pregnant. He must love his wife really a lot for him to be willing to have two babies within mere like a few months of each other. What in the world? Anyways, it could have easily been a formula for disaster, but it worked. Right from the start, the two IMOs found that they shared a unique synergy. Their collaboration was symbolic of the deep intellectual divide that ran through the front lines of ontology, the rift between over-moderated caution and bold experimentation. Each time Freireich pushed too hard on one end of the experimental fulcrum, often bringing himself and his patients to the brink of disaster, Fry pushed back to ensure that the novel, quixotic, and deeply toxic therapies were mitigated by caution. Fry and Freireich's battle soon became emblematic of the tussles within the NCI. Fry's job, one researcher recalled in those days, was to keep Freireich from getting in trouble. And that's a break. Let's see how many. So we got 1, 2, 3 and a half. 3.5. Woohoo! Let's keep going. Let's push through and get to the next chapter. Zubrod had his own schemes to keep leukemia research out of trouble. As new drugs, combinations, and trials proliferated, Zubrod worried that institutions would be caught at cross purposes, squabbling over patients and protocols when they really should be battling cancer. Birkenau in New York, Farber in Boston, James Holland at Roswell Park, and the two IMOs at the NCI were all chomping at the bit to launch clinical trials. And since ALL was a rare disease, every patient was a precious resource for a leukemia trial. To avert conflicts, Zubrod proposed that a consortium of researchers be created to share patients' trials, data, and knowledge. The proposal changed the field. Zubrod's cooperative group model galvanized cancer medicine. Said Robert Meyer, who would later become the chair of one of these groups. For the first time, an academic oncologist felt as if he had a community. The cancer doctor was not the outcast anymore, not the man who prescribed potions from some underground chamber in the hospital. The first group meeting, chaired by Farber, was a resounding success. The researchers agreed to proceed with a series of common trials called protocols as soon as possible. I just saw another piece that had to be put in. Zubrod set about organizing the process by which trials could be run. Cancer trials, he argued, had thus far been embarrassingly chaotic and disorganized. Oncologists need to emulate the best trials in medicine. And to learn how to run objective, unbiased, state-of-the-art clinical trials, they would need to study the history of the development of antibiotics. In the 1940s, as new antibiotics had begun to appear on the horizon, physicians had encountered an important quandary. How might one objectively test the efficacy of any novel drug? At the Medical Research Council in Britain, the question had taken on a particularly urgent and rancorous note. The discovery of streptomycin, a new antimicrobial drug in the early 40s, had set off a flurry of optimism that tuberculosis could be cured. Streptomycin killed tuberculosis-causing mycobacteria in petri dishes, but its efficacy in humans was unknown. The drug was in critically short supply, with doctors parrying to use even a few milligrams of it to treat a variety of other infections. To ration streptomycin, an objective experiment to determine its efficacy in human tuberculosis was needed. But what sort of experiment? An English statistician named Bradford Hill, a former victim of TB himself, proposed an extraordinary solution. Hill began by recognizing that doctors, of all people, could not be entrusted to perform such an experiment without inherent biases. Every biological experiment requires a control arm, untreated subjects against whom the efficacy of a treatment can be judged. But left to their own devices, doctors were inevitably likely, even if unconsciously so, to select certain types of patients up front, then judge the effects of a drug on this highly skewed population using subjective criteria, such piling bias upon bias. I'm just running through this chapter. Hill's proposed solution was to remove such biases by randomly assigning patients to treatment with streptomycin versus a placebo. By randomizing patients to each arm, any doctor's biases in patient assignment would be dispelled, neutrality would be enforced, and thus a hypothesis could be strictly tested. Hill's randomized trial was a success. The streptomycin arm of the trial clearly showed an improved response over the placebo arm, enshrining the antibiotic as a new anti-TB drug. But perhaps more important, it was Hill's methodological invention that was permanently enshrined. For medical scientists, the randomized trial became the most stringent means to evaluate the efficacy of any intervention in the most unbiased manner. Zubrod was inspired by these early antimicrobial trials. He had used these principles in the late 1940s to test antimalarials, and he proposed using them to lay down the principles by which the NCI would test its new protocols. The NCI's trials would be systematic. Every trial would test a crucial piece of logic or hypothesis and produce yes or no answers. The trials would be sequential. The lessons of one trial would lead to the next, and so forth, a relentless march of progress until leukemia had been cured. The trials will be objective, randomized if possible, with clear, unbiased criteria to assign patients and measure responses. And let's just go on. We've got like 2 pages left. Come on. All right. Trial methodology was not the only powerful lesson that Zubrod, Fry, and Freireich learned from the antimicrobial world. The analogy of drug resistance to antibiotics was given deep thought, Freireich remembered. As Farber and Birkenau had discovered to their chagrin in Boston and New York, leukemia treated with a single drug would inevitably grow resistant to the drug, resulting in the flickering transient responses followed by the devastating relapses. The situation was reminiscent of TB. Like cancer cells, mycobacteria, the germs that cause TB, also became resistant to antibiotics if the drugs were used singly. Bacteria that survived a single drug regimen divided, mutated, and acquired drug resistance, thus making that original drug useless. To thwart this resistance, doctors treating TB had used a blitzkrieg of antibiotics. 2 or 3 used together like a dense pharmaceutical blanket meant to smother all cell division and stave off bacterial resistance, thus extinguishing the infection as definitively as possible. But could 2 or 3 of these drugs be tested simultaneously using cancer, or would the toxicities be so forbidding that they would instantly kill patients? As Freireich, Frey, and Zubrod studied the growing list of anti-leukemia drugs, the notion of combining drugs emerged with growing clarity. Toxicities notwithstanding, annihilating leukemia might involve using a combination of 2 or more drugs. The first protocol was launched to test different doses of Farber's methotrexate combined with Burkinab's 6-MP, the 2 most active anti-leukemia drugs. 3 hospitals agreed to join: the NCI, Roswell Park, and the Children's Hospital in Buffalo, New York. The aims of the trial were kept intentionally simple. One group would be treated with intense methotrexate dosing, while the other group would be treated with milder and less intensive dosing. 84 patients enrolled. On arrival day, parents of the children were handed white envelopes with a randomized assignment sealed inside. Despite the multiple centers and the many egos involved, the trial ran surprisingly smoothly. Toxicities multiplied. The 2-drug regimen was barely tolerable, but the intensive group fared better, with longer and more durable responses. The regimen, though, was far from a cure. Even the intensively treated children soon relapsed and died by the end of 1 year. Protocol 1 set an important precedent. Zubrod's and Farber's cherished model of a cancer cooperative group was finally in action. Dozens of doctors, nurses, and patients in 3 independent hospitals had yoked themselves to follow a single formula to treat a group of patients, and each one, suspending its own idiosyncrasies, had followed the instructions perfectly. This work is one of the first comparative studies in the chemotherapy of malignant neoplastic disease, Frey noted. In a world of ad hoc, often desperate strategies, conformity had finally come to cancer. In the winter of 1957, the leukemia group launched yet another modification to the first experiment. This time, one group received a combined regimen, while the other 2 groups were given 1 drug each. And with the question even more starkly demarcated, the pattern of responses was even clearer. Given alone, either of the drugs performed poorly, with a response rate between 50 and 20%. But when methotrexate and 6-MP were administered together, the remission rate jumped to 45%. The next chemotherapy protocol, launched just 2 years later in 1959, ventured into even riskier territory. Patients were treated with 2 drugs to send them into complete remission. Then half the group received several months of additional drugs, while the other group was given a placebo. Once again, the pattern was consistent. The more aggressively treated group has longer and more durable responses. Trial by trial, the group crept forward like a spring uncoiling to its end. In just 6 pivotal years, the leukemia study group had slowly worked itself to giving patients not 1 or 2, but 4 chemotherapy drugs, often in succession. But by the winter of 1952, the compass of leukemia medicine pointed unfailingly in one direction. If 2 drugs were better than 1, and if 3 were better than 2, then what if 4 anti-leukemia drugs could be given together, in combination, as with TB? Both Frey and Freireich sensed that this was the inevitable culmination of the NCI's trials. But even if they knew it subconsciously, they tiptoed around the notion for months. The resistance would be fierce, Freireich knew. The leukemia war was already being called a butcher shop by others at the NCI. The idea of treating children with 3 or 4 highly cytotoxic drugs was considered cruel and insane, Freireich said. Even Zubrod could not convince the consortium to try it. No one wanted to turn the NCI into a National Institute of Butchery. And that is the end of the fucking chapter. Come on, 20 minutes, speed run time, man, speed run. Woo! Alright, let's go. How about the Earth? Oh my god. We can just do 3 chapters today, because this next one is 1, 2, 3, Yeah, 3 pages, and then there's another one with 3 pages as well. Homo. Okay, come on. Let's do this thing. All right. Next chapter is called An Early Victory, so we know it's gonna go well. All right. But I do subscribe to the view that words have very powerful texts and subtexts. War has truly a unique status. War has a very special meaning. It means putting young men and women in situations where they might get killed or grievously wounded. It's inappropriate to retain that metaphor for a scholarly activity in these times of actual war. The NIH is a community of scholars focused on generating knowledge to improve the public health. That's a great activity. That's not a war. And that's by Samuel Broder, the NCI director. And that's the opening quote. In the midst of this nervy deliberation about the use of 4-drug combination therapy, Fry and Freireich received an enormously exciting piece of news. Just a few doors down from Freireich's office at the NCI, 2 researchers, Min-Chiu Lee and Roy Hertz, had been experimenting with choriocarcinoma, a cancer of the placenta. Even rarer than leukemia, choriocarcinoma often grows out of the placental tissue surrounding an abnormal pregnancy, then metastasizes rapidly and fatally into the lung and the brain. When it occurs, choriocarcinoma is thus a double tragedy: an abnormal pregnancy compounded by a lethal malignancy, birth tipped into death. If cancer chemotherapists were genuinely considered outsiders by the medical community in the 1950s, then Min-Chiu Lee was an outsider even among outsiders. He had come to the United States from Mukden University in China, then spent a brief stint at the Memorial Hospital in New York. In a scramble to dodge the draft during the Korean War, he had finagled a 2-year position in Hertz's service as an assistant obstetrician. He was interested in research, or at least feigned interest, but Lee was considered an intellectual fugitive, unable to commit to one question or plan. His current plan was to lie low in Bethesda until the war blew over. But what had started as a decoy fellowship for Lee turned within a single evening in August 1956 into a full-time obsession. On call late one evening, he tried to medically stabilize a woman with metastatic choriocarcinoma. The tumor was in its advanced stages and bled so profusely that the patient died in front of Lee's eyes in 3 hours. Lee had heard of Farber's antifolates. Almost instinctually, he had made a link between the rapidly dividing leukemia cells in the bone marrow of children in Boston and the rapidly dividing placenta cells in the women in Bethesda. Antifolates had never been tried in this disease, but if the drugs could stop aggressive leukemias from growing, even if temporarily, might they not at least partially revive the eruptions of choriocarcinoma? Lee did not have to wait long. A few weeks after the first case, another patient, a young woman called Ethel Longoria, was just as terrifyingly ill as the first patient. Her tumors, growing in grape-like clusters in her lungs, had begun to bleed into the linings of her lungs, so fast that it had become nearly impossible to keep up with the blood loss. She was bleeding so rapidly, a hematologist recalled, that we thought we might transfuse her back with her own blood. So the doctors scrambled around and set up tubes to collect the blood that she had bled and put it right back into her, like an internal pump. The solution bore the quintessential mark of the NCI. Transfusing a person with blood leaking out from her own tumor would have been considered extraordinary, even repulsive elsewhere. But at the NCI, any strategy, was par for the course. They stabilized her and then started antifolates. After the first dose, when the doctors left for the night, they didn't expect that they'd just find her in rounds the next morning. At the NCI, you didn't expect. You just waited and watched and took surprises as they came. Ethel Longoria hung on. At rounds the next morning, she was still alive, breathing slowly but deeply. The bleeding had now abated to the point that a few more doses could be tried. At the end of 4 rounds of chemotherapy, Lee and Hertz expected to see minor changes in the size of the tumors. What they had found instead left them flabbergasted. The tumor masses disappeared, the chest x-ray improved, and the patient looked normal. Freireich wrote, The level of choriogonadotropin, the hormone secreted by the cancer cells, rapidly plummeted towards zero. The tumor had actually vanished. No one had ever seen such a response. The X-rays, thought to have been mixed up, were sent down for re-examination. The response was real. A metastatic solid cancer had vanished with chemotherapy. Jubilant, Lee and Hertz rushed to publish their findings. And that was a break, but we'll keep going. But there was a glitch in all this. Oh no. An observation so minor that it could easily have been brushed away. Choriocarcinoma cells secrete a marker, a hormone called choriogonadotropin, a protein that can be measured with an extremely sensitive test in the blood. A variation of this test is used to detect pregnancies. Early in his experiments, Lee had decided that he would use that hormone level to track the course of the cancer as it responded to methotrexate. The HCG level, as it was called, would be a surrogate for the cancer, its fingerprint in the blood. The trouble was, at the end of the scheduled chemotherapy, the HCG level had fallen to an almost negligible value, but to Lee's annoyance, it hadn't gone all the way to normal. He measured and remeasured it in his laboratory weekly, but it persisted, a pipsqueak of a number that wouldn't go away. Lee became progressively obsessed with the number. The hormone in the blood, he reasoned, was the fingerprint of cancer, and if it was still present, then the cancer had to be present too, hiding in the body somewhere, even if the visible tumors had disappeared. So, despite every other indication that the tumors had vanished, Lee reasoned that his patients had not been fully cured. In the end, he seemed almost to be treating a number rather than a patient, ignoring the added toxicity of additional rounds of the drug. Ignoring the added toxicity of additional rounds of the drug, Lee doggedly administered dose upon dose until, at last, the HCG levels sank to zero. When the institutional board at the NCI got wind of Lee's decision, it responded with fury. The patients were women who had supposedly been cured of cancer. Their tumors were invisible, and giving them additional chemotherapy was tantamount to poisoning them with unpredictable doses of highly toxic drugs. Lee was already known to be a renegade and an iconoclast. This time, the NCI felt he had gone too far. In mid-July, the board summoned him to a meeting and promptly fired him. Lee was accused of experimenting on people, Freireich said, but of course all of us were experimenting. Tom and Zubrod and the rest of them, we were all experimenters. To not experiment would mean to follow the old rules, to do absolutely nothing. Lee wasn't prepared to sit back and watch and do nothing, so he was fired for acting on his convictions, for doing something. Freireich and Lee had been medical residents together in Chicago. At the NCI, they had developed a kinship as two outcasts. When Freireich heard about Lee's dismissal, he immediately went over to Lee's house to console him, but Lee was inconsolable. In a few months, he huffed over to New York, bound back from Memorial Sloan Kettering. He never returned to the NCI. But the story had a final plot twist. As they had predicted, with several additional doses of methotrexate, the hormone level that he had so compulsively trailed did finally vanish to zero. His patients finished their additional cycles of chemotherapy. Then slowly, a pattern began to emerge. When the patients who had stopped using the drug early inevitably relapsed with cancer, the patients treated on Lee's protocol remained free of disease, even months after the methotrexate had been stopped. Lee had stumbled on a deep and fundamental principle of oncology. Cancer needed to be systematically treated long after every visible sign of it had vanished. The HCG level, or the hormone secreted by choriocarcinoma, had turned out to be its real fingerprint, its marker. In the decades that followed, trial after trial would prove its principle. But in 1960, oncology was not yet ready for this proposal. Not until several years later did it strike the board that had fired Lee so hastily that the patients he had treated with the prolonged maintenance strategy would never relapse. This strategy, which cost Min-Chu Lee his job, resulted in the first chemotherapeutic cure for cancer in adults. Woo! That's great. Anyways, on to the next chapter. Yeah, just brush it aside, yeah. And the next chapter is called Mice of, no, not of Mice and Men, just Mice and Men. Alright. And this quote is quite relevant nowadays. It's called, "A model is a lie that helps you see the truth." I just think that's very relevant for today. Alright. Min Chu Lee's experience with choriocarcinoma was a philosophical nudge for Fry and Freireich. Clinical research is a matter of urgency, Freireich argued. For a child with leukemia, even a week's delay meant the difference between life and death. The academic stodginess of the Leukemia Consortium, its insistence on progressively and systematically testing one drug combination after another, was now driving Freireich progressively and systematically mad. To test these drugs, the group insisted on testing all of the 3 possible combinations, and then you got to do all the 4 combinations, and then with different doses and schedules for each. At the rate that the Leukemia Consortium was moving, he argued, it would take dozens of years before any significant advance in leukemia was made. The wards were filling up with these terribly sick children. A boy or girl might be brought in with a white cell count of 300 and be dead overnight. I was the one sent the next morning to speak with the parents. Try explaining Zubrod's strategy of sequential, systematic, and objective trials to a woman whose daughter has just slumped into a coma and died, Freireich recalled. The permutations of possible drugs and doses were further increased when yet another new anti-cancer agent was introduced at the clinical center in 1960. The newcomer, vincristine, was a poisonous plant alkaloid that came from the Madagascar periwinkle, a small weed-like creeper with violet flowers and an entwined coiled stem. The name vincristine comes from vinca, the Latin word for bind. Vincristine had been discovered in 1958 at the Eli Lilly Company through a drug discovery program that involved grinding up thousands of pounds of plant material and testing the extracts in various biological assays. Although originally intended to be an anti-diabetic, although initially intended to be an anti-diabetic, vincristine at small doses was found to kill leukemia cells. Rapidly growing cells, such as those of leukemia, typically create a skeletal scaffold of proteins called microtubules that allow 2 daughter cells to separate from one another and thereby complete cell division. Vincristine works by binding to the end of each of these microtubules and thus paralyzing the cellular skeleton in its grip, thus quite literally evoking the Latin word after which it was originally named. With vincristine added to the pharmacopoeia, leukemia researchers found themselves facing the paradox of excess. How might one take 4 independently active drugs, methotrexate, prednisone, 6-MP, and vincristine, and stitch them all together into an effective regimen? And since each drug was potentially severely toxic, could one ever find a combination that would kill the leukemia but not kill a child? 2 drugs had already spawned dozens of possibilities. With 4 drugs, the Leukemia Consortium would take not 50, but 150 years to finish its trials. David Nathan, then a new recruit at the NCI, recalled the near standstill created by the avalanche of new medicines. Fry and Freireich were simply taking drugs that were available and adding them together in combinations. The possible combinations, doses, and schedules of 4 and 5 drugs was infinite. Researchers could work for years on finding the right combination of drugs and schedules. Zubrod's sequential, systematic, objective trials had reached an impasse. What was needed was quite the opposite of a systematic approach, an intuitive and inspired leap of faith into the deadly abyss of deadly drugs. A scientist from Alabama, Howard Skipper, a scholarly, soft-spoken man who liked to call himself a mouse doctor, provided Fry and Freireich a way out of the impasse. Skipper was an outsider to the NCI. If leukemia was a model form of cancer, then Skipper had been studying the disease by artificially inducing leukemias in animals. in effect by building a model of a model. Skipper's model used a mouse cell line called L1210, a lymphoid leukemia that could be grown in a petri dish. When laboratory mice were injected with these cells, they would acquire the leukemia, a process known as engraftment because it was akin to transferring a piece of normal tissue, a graft, from one animal to another. Skipper liked to think about cancer not as a disease, but as an abstract mathematical entity. In the mouse transplanted with L1210 cells, the cells divided with nearly obscene fecundity, often twice a day, a rate startling even for cancer cells. A single leukemia cell engrafted into the mice could thus take off in a terrifying arc of numbers: 1, 4, 16, 64, 256, 1024, 4096, to 16,384, 65,536, 262,144, 1,048,576, and so forth, all the way to infinity. In 16 or 17 days, 6-7, more than 2 billion daughter cells could grow out of that single cell, more than the entire number of blood cells in the mouse. Skipper learned that he could halt this effusive cell division by administering chemotherapy to the leukemia-engrafted mouse. By charting the life and death of leukemia cells as they responded to drugs in the mice, Skipper emerged with two pivotal findings. First, he found that chemotherapy typically killed a fixed percentage of cells at any given instance, no matter what the total number of cancer cells was. This percentage was a unique cardinal number particular to every drug. In other words, if you started out with 100,000 leukemia cells in a mouse and administered a drug that killed 99% of the cells in a single round, then every round would kill cells in a fractional manner, resulting in fewer and fewer cells after each round of chemotherapy. 100,000 became 1,000, became 10, and so forth, until the number finally fell to zero after 4 rounds. Killing leukemia was an iterative process, like having a monster's body, then having the half, and then having the remnant half. Oh, man. Oh, come on, it doesn't... Really? I thought it... Oh, there we go. Okay. It took me a while. Second, Skipper found that by adding drugs in combination, he could often get synergistic effects in killing. Since different drugs elicited different resistance mechanisms and produced different toxicities in cancer cells, using drugs in concert dramatically lowered the chance of resistance and increased cell killing. 2 drugs were therefore typically better than 1, and 3 drugs better than 2. With several drugs and several iterative rounds of chemotherapy in rapid-fire succession, Skipper cured leukemias in his mouse model. For Fry and Freireich, Skipper's observations had an inevitable if frightening conclusion. If human leukemias were like Skipper's mouse leukemias, then children would need to be tested with a regimen containing not 1 or 2, but multiple drugs. Furthermore, a single treatment would not suffice. Maximal, intermittent, intensive, upfront chemotherapy would need to be administered with nearly ruthless, inexorable persistence, dose after dose after dose after dose, pushing the outermost limits of tolerability. There would be no stopping, not even after the leukemia cells had apparently disappeared in the blood and the children had apparently been cured. Fry and Freireich were now ready to take their pivotal and intuitive leap into the abyss. The next regimen they would try would be a combination of all 4 drugs: vincristine, amitriptyline, mercaptopurine, and prednisone. The regimen would be known by a new acronym, with each letter standing for one of the drugs: VAMP. The name had many intended and unintended resonances. Vamp is a word that means to improvise or patch up, to cobble something together from bits or pieces that might crumble apart any second. It can mean a seductress, one who promises but does not deliver. It also refers to the front of the boot, the part that carries the full brunt of force during a kick. Really? I was thinking of like a vampire. And they come up with a fucking femme fatale and like the front part of a boot and to cobble up something. Really? Dang. Okay. You go, English language. Sure. Okay. And the next one is like 7 pages long. Yikes. And the next one is even more. Okay. I think we'll stop here for today. But we were productive. We were fucking productive, man. Good job on us, man. Good job. Ow. Fucking hurt, man. Don't do that ever again. Alright. I will get going, do some more work on my own stuff. See you guys later.